I'm Pastor Dennis Gallagher, and you're watching What Really Matters, gleanings from my years of ministry and applying God's Word to real life. You know, this has been a whirlwind of a week, so this edition is a bit late for some of you. But in a way, being late fits into this topic very well. Anyone who has faithfully served God and His kingdom can relate to the story that I want to tell you. For some, it seems that when we need God to move on our behalf, He's always late. Oh well, you're in good company. Listen to this story from the life of the good King Hezekiah. After the Bible records his life events, both the good and the bad, it ends around this verse. It simply says, God left him alone, only to test him, that he might know all that was in his heart. Does God really do that? Does He pull back from rescuing or helping or even comforting His servants to see what is in our hearts? Well, the answer from my life is yes, He does. Now, the word test can be defined two different ways. One way is to think of a test as something that will have a grade attached to it. In that sense, a test is always going to prove whether or not someone can make the grade. But there is another, much older understanding of the process as well. It's the process of testing metal. When the old refiner would begin the process of creating a valuable piece of jewelry, he would begin by testing or refining the metal. The book of Malachi says that the Lord sits as a refiner and purifier of silver, and He will refine us like gold or silver. Well, the refiner would heat his crucible, think of trials, all the way to the point where the precious metal would melt and the alloys and the dross would rise to the top. He would then carefully skim the surface until all that was left was the pure gold. Amy Carmichael is one of my favorite writers. She was a legendary missionary to India during the 19th and 20th century. She tells the story of the village smith who she found one day staring into his crucible, watching the metal as it released the dross. She asked him, "How long will you sit and stare into that crucible?" Well, without looking up, he simply said, "Until I can see my face." What a lesson. God not only wants to see what is in our hearts, but He wants to test. He wants to refine our hearts to remove the dross. God tested Abraham. "Take now your son, your only son, and offer him as a burnt offering." Quite a test. He wanted to see what was in his heart. He tested the whole nation of Israel. It says that the Lord led you these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether it would be following His commandments or not. The Lord tested Peter. "Peter, you will not only deny me, but you'll deny me 3 times. And when you finish, go and strengthen your brothers." The Lord tested Paul. "Paul, now that I've knocked you off your high horse, go and wait for 3 days for me to send someone, and then you will have the understanding of what I'll have you to do." Over and over we see God seeming to remove His care in order to test and purify the hearts of His chosen vessels. Now, Arthur Pearson was a Presbyterian minister who worked among the urban poor in the late 18th century. He said this. He said, "Our Father, who seeks to perfect His saints in holiness, knows the value of the refiner's fire. It is with the most precious metals that the assayer takes the most pains and subjects them to the hot fire, because such fires melt the metal, and only the molten mass releases its alloy or takes perfectly in new form in the mold. The old refiner never leaves his crucible, but he sits down by it, lest there should be one excessive degree of heat to mar the metal. But as soon as he skims the surface, the last of the dross, and he sees his own face reflected, he puts out the fire. Have you been left alone by God? You know, even David knew the absence of God's comfort. He said in Psalms 10, "Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide yourself in time of trouble?" You know, that's a good question with a very good answer. And I'm thankful that David had the gumption to ask it. Many people would be ashamed to so vocally ask God such a question, but not David. The answer runs from Genesis all the way through Revelations, though. It is because God is more interested in my character than my comfort. He is more concerned about my future value than my current assets. He places far more value in my heart than in my ever-changing emotions. Are you sitting in a crucible right now? Well, take courage. You're in very good company. In fact, the very reason that we look to the lives of the old saints is because of what they went through. So in the midst of the fire, remember this: God's activity on me is the sign of his value in me and the promise of his plans for me. This is Dennis Gallagher. I'm praying for you. Please pray for me.